The mysterious illusion of self. To study the way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be enlightened by all things. Zen Master Dogen. We take things very personally. The more tightly we hold self, the more problem. No self? Well, no problem. Master Hina Dhyana Dhamma Loka. At the end of the Buddhist ordination ceremony, in the sacred grove deep in the forest monastery, the new monk is given the first meditation instruction. It is the inquiry, who am I? A practice of systemic self-investigation. Starting with the body, we ask, am I the skin, the hair, the muscles and bones, the organs or the blood? Am I this body? Modern science tells us that the molecules of the body are completely replaced every 7 years. If I'm not the physical elements of this body, then what am I? Am I the stream of changing feelings? Am I the memories and perceptions? Am I the thoughts and concepts, the views and beliefs? Who am I? This is not a theoretical question. It is the most practical question for us to ask in the midst of our problems and our sorrows. Who do I take myself to be? At work, in my family, in my community, in my own heart? The way we answer this question can lead to entanglement and struggle, or, no matter where we are, to freedom and ease. It is absolutely crucial to understand the human predicament. According to the classic Buddhist understanding, two mental states create the sense of self. One is called self-view, which takes some aspect of experience as I, me, or mine. The second is compared view, which evaluates the created sense of self as better than or worse than or equal to others. We create a sense of self whenever we identify with our body, our mind, our beliefs, our roles, our situation in life. This identification happens unconsciously over and over whenever we hold our feelings, thoughts and This identification happens unconsciously over and over whenever we hold our feelings, thoughts and perceptions as me or mine. The sense of self can be created in healthy and unhealthy ways. A friend loses an election for a seat on the local school board after some scurrilous things are said about her. She identifies with the blame. She takes it very personally. A man is told by his aging, controlling father that he probably won't be included in the will. Only his good sister will get the money. He compares himself to them and becomes lost and identified with the role of the rejected son. A woman's daughter gets pregnant and becomes a mother at 17. The older woman identifies herself as a bad mother who let this happen to her daughter. The grandchild is born and she is beautiful. The woman lets go of all the judgment and becomes an excited, loving grandmother. Now this is her identity and redeems her life. But then her daughter moves away. She identifies herself as a person who is always abandoned or betrayed. Who is she really? In Buddhist training, we inquire into the very notion of identity, asking who we are in the midst of all these roles. As we do, we find the layers of identity opening and dropping away or dissolving gradually through the systemic practice of mindfulness. We discover how our identification with a limited sense of self creates our suffering. Releasing ourselves from these limits can free us from a lifetime of struggle. This is a fifth principle of Buddhist psychology. Our ideas of self are created by identification. The less we cling to ideas of self, the freer and happier we will be. Mitch, who came to a meditation retreat, had a long, painful history. At age 4, his gambler father abandoned the family and was replaced by a stepfather who physically and sexually abused all 3 children. By high school, Mitch had begun a serious drug habit to numb the pain. His older sister had been in and out of the mental hospital. In 12-step groups, Mitch had found enough support to finish college and develop a career as a software engineer. Now Mitch was married and had 2 children of his own. Reading about Buddhism, Mitch found that the systemic approach to inner life appealed to his technical intelligence. Although the first few retreats he attended were difficult and he experienced a lot of restlessness, he persisted and gradually discovered that he struggled less with his body pain and thought processes. Much relieved, he registered for another retreat. At that retreat, Mitch began to fall apart. All of the adult roles he had worked so hard to construct, his sense of himself as an engineer, a father, a husband, seemed like a false front. He began to re-experience the terrible state of fear and confusion he had lived in as a child. He was experiencing the regression that often happens on retreat. He looked hurt, frightened, and very young. Mitch was afraid that his pain would last forever. I encouraged him to trust that he could learn to tolerate it all. I feel so terrible, so worthless. How do I work with this? He asked. I invited him to take a few breaths and sense his body seated on the earth. When he was ready, he began to mindfully examine the state of his body. It felt small, tight, pained, contracted. Painful though it was, he gradually relaxed around it. I invited him to notice whatever feelings were present. There was shock, vulnerability, helplessness, fear, and anger. I inquired how old he felt. 8, he stated. Then I asked, and what thoughts and stories arise with these feelings? He told me, I keep saying, I hate myself, I'm a terrible person, it feels like this will last forever. Gradually, Mitch was able to step back and witness these thoughts with mindfulness. Then I asked Mitch, and the stories you have told for so long, are they true? Is this who you are? I looked at him gently and directly. His sense of identity with the story began to become shaky, uncertain. I went on. All the changing sensations of your body, the pain and tension, is that who you are? Not exactly. And the difficult feelings, the fear and helplessness, are these your true self? Well, no. And the judgmental thoughts and stories, are these who you are? No. I contain all these things, but no, they are not who I am. And who is being aware of all of this? Look and see. I can't exactly find anybody. There is awareness, but I'm not sure who's being aware. How does it feel? With a big laugh, Mitch said, much, much freer. We sat for a time, resting in the awareness. Gradually, Mitch was learning to open to each level of experience without resistance or identification. Like the Buddha witnessing the painful conditions of a past life, he practiced holding it all with great compassion. In doing so, some part of him learned that the injured self was not who he really is. Slowly, Mitch began to heal. In dialogue with his followers, the Buddha regularly asked them to inquire into their true nature. Monks, these things which are constantly changing, can we call them the self? No, sir, they are not. Are the changing sense experiences of the body the self? No, sir, they replied. Are the changing feelings and perceptions the self? No, sir, they are not. Are the changing thoughts and mental formations the self? No, sir, they are not. And are the changing states of consciousness to be grasped as self? No, venerable sir. In the ultimate sense, the Buddha went on, all these are found to be selfless. What we take to be a self is tentative, fictitious, constructed by clinging, a temporary identification with some parts of experience. Self arises, solidifying itself like ice floating in water. Ice is actually made of the same substance as water. Identification and clinging harden the water into ice. In a similar way, we sense ourselves as separate. The paradox of development. Both Western and Buddhist psychologies acknowledge the need for a healthy development of self. Indeed, from a Western clinical perspective, not finding an identity is considered a crisis. Ordinarily, the development of a healthy sense of self is a natural process. In Western psychology, Freud and his followers described the stages of the self's development and how a child gradually separates her identity from her mother, sensing herself as a separate being. As a child discovers that her deepest needs and longings are not always met by the mother, a powerful need arises to manage and control the unpredictable world, and her sense of self grows stronger. Her mind learns to sense itself as separate and to cope with the fears and frustrations of life by developing comforting memories, language skills, and problem solving strategies. The successful sense of self identifies with maturing physical and social capacities. The functioning of the central capacity, called ego by Freud, is one of the most important definitions of mental health in Western psychology. A similar development of self is described in such Buddhist psychological texts as the Visuddhim. A similar development of self is described in such Buddhist psychological texts as the Visuddhimagga, Visuddhimagga. They tell how the original radiance of beings born on earth becomes changed as they shift from the ambrosia of mother's milk to solid food. Liking and disliking grow stronger and frustrations form. The world where all the food originally tastes of jasmine flowers becomes harder. The new beings become aware of their need to urinate and defecate. They become conscious of maleness and femaleness and brood over one another. They set up boundaries of I and mine and hit one another, creating the need for self-protection. Then they learn to restrain their impulses and inner leadership grows. To help navigate the world, the tentative sense of self grows stronger through these various stages. From the smallest organisms through complex life forms to human beings, the creation of boundaries and the perception of separateness is universal. The gift of Buddhist psychology is to take us to the next step, the evolutionary capacity to see beyond the separate self. The functional self, even at its most healthy, is not who we are. And to the extent that we adults remain caught and identified with any of the earlier stages of development, our suffering is perpetuated. Unlike its Western counterpart, Buddhist psychology recognizes that the ordinary process of development does not end the story. From a functional self, it offers a path to the discovery of selflessness. It shows us how the sense of self is created moment by moment. Then it dissolves identification and shows the joyful openness which exists beyond the self. When we compare the understanding of self in Buddhist and Western psychology, the language can be confusing. For example, there is a dual use of the psychological concept of ego. Technically, in Western psychology, ego describes a healthy organizing aspect of mind. But in common spiritual parlance, ego has a more negative connotation, as in egotistical, selfish. Similarly, in describing the self, we find a sometimes bewildering multiplicity of terms, all the way from the healthy sense of self to the Buddhist description of no self. The following diagram offers some clarification. In Western psychology, ego, theoretical use. Used to describe the necessary organizing function of the mind, regulates energies from superego, conditioned beliefs, and id, unconscious drives. There can be a healthy ego or a fragile, needy ego. Healthy sense of self. Functional ability to direct life, deal with frustrations, marshal resources, cope with conflict, work, love, create, and care for self and others. Buddhist psychology, ego, common spiritual use. Used to describe states of clinging and identification and the qualities of self-importance and self-centeredness that arise from the small sense of self, derives from illusions of separation and the anxiety it creates. Mental health, maturing of healthy mental qualities such as wisdom, confidence, composure, flexibility, love, integrity, insight, and generosity. Non-self. Discovery that sense of self and separation is tentative, false, created by clinging and identification. Release from identification with self brings the highest mental health, freedom, compassion, and joy. Identification. When we first hear them, the teachings of non-self can arouse confusion or even fear. We might fear that non-self means the loss of ourself, as if it were going to die. But the psychology of non-self is quite different. In practice, we don't have to change or get rid of anything. We merely learn to see through the false ideas of ourselves. We discover that we can let go of the limited sense of self, that grasping and identification are optional. To examine this process of identification, let yourself play with it as you read. Imagine you are this book. Identify with it. Pretend it is you. How do you feel as a book? I am a new book. I have a nice cover. I am full of words and understanding. Some people are interested in me. I like to be read. Maybe I'll become a big seller, famous. Maybe not. Now notice what happens when you close the book. Close it gently. I like to be respected. Open it again and slam it shut. Toss it under a cushion or hide it amongst other books. How does this feel? I don't like to be slammed shut. I don't want to be put away and lost. I don't like being dropped or hidden. Now stop identifying with the book. Now it is just a book. Open and close it again. Put it away or hide it. Notice how different this feels. The book is not you. This process of identification happens all the time. The Indian guru with whom I studied, Sri Nisargadatta, used to laugh and say, "You identify with everything so easily, with your body, your thoughts, your opinions, your roles, and so you suffer. I have released all identification." He would explain by holding up his hand. "Look how my thumb and forefingers touch. When I identify with my forefinger, I am the feeler and the thumb is the object that I experience. Reverse the identification and I am the thumb, feeling this forefinger as an object. I find that somehow by shifting the focus of attention, I become the very thing I look at. I call this capacity of entering other focal points of consciousness love. You may give it any name you like. Love says, I am everything. Wisdom says, I am nothing. Between these two, my life flows. The ability to shift identities does not belong only to Indian gurus. It is a human skill. Many tasks cultivate an ability to enter into other identities. The best animal trackers become the animal they are following. Skillful detectives get inside the identity of their quarry. Actors succeed by their abilities to convincingly enter other identities. A mother naturally and instinctively identifies with her baby and knows why she is crying. Lovers say their hearts beat as one. This healthy release of identification is not the self-estrangement of a psychotic looking at his hand as a foreign object. That is a misguided disconnection, the result of delusion and pathology. Nor is the release of identification a denial of the marvelous, singular, and unique essence of every individual. Our uniqueness remains, but without self-centered grasping and fear. We discover that our identity is more tentative, fluid, like a river, each moment born anew. Wisdom says we are nothing. Love says we are everything. Between these two, our life flows. Identification with role and image. We can study identification directly by examining the many roles of life gives us to play. We can study identification directly by examining. We can study identification directly by examining the many roles life gives us to play. At times, for example, I can sense myself as a man. Son, parent, worker, student, husband, father, teacher, taxpayer, healer, patient, citizen, rebel, and member of a particular tribe, ethnic group, and religion. All are roles. Each arises due to circumstances and conditions. When we are young, we feel the role of son or daughter most strongly when we are with our parents. We try to fulfill it and behave accordingly. Yet, when our parents are absent, or yet, when our parents are absent and we are playing with our friends, our role as son or daughter drops away, unless, of course, we have a mother who, because of her own shaky identity, insists that we think about her all the time. For 40 hours a week, many of us enact our role as worker or provider. Yet, to the extent that we cling to any of these identities, we suffer. If I try to keep my role as Buddhist teacher when I come home, it is a disaster. If I offer my frazzled wife Buddhist teachings on patience or generosity, she will feel patronized and simply remind me that it's my turn to water the garden and do the dishes. My daughter does not want a teacher of meditation or a psychologist. She wants an ordinary father who will listen, understand her experiences, and be playful, supportive, and sympathetic. When I am a partner, husband, and father, the three of us learn from each other. If a policewoman can't relax and be just a human being when she's out with her friends, she's imprisoned by her identity. If a CAO can't let go of his work when it's time to care for his son, they both suffer. I think of a cartoon I saw of a family on a Martha's Vineyard beach. Everyone is in swimsuits except the father. He is wearing his three-piece business suit and holding his briefcase. His wife is laughing. Just because you go to the office every day. The cartoon is funny, but it has tragic undertones. To be wise, we need to be able to enter each role fully with awareness and compassion, and to let it go when our part is done. When we marry, we have to let go of being single. When our children become adults, we have to let go of our old role of helping manage their life. When we take a new job or leave one, retire, or change from employee to manager, we need to let one role go and take up another. We can be free only if underneath all these temporary roles we do not forget that they are not who we really are. In the same way that we identify with a role, we can identify with a self-image. Do I look intelligent, attractive, strong? Usually we worry in this way because we also feel the opposite qualities in ourselves. So to compensate, we create a self-image. A colleague of mine found these compensatory thoughts so frequent in his meditation, he began to humorously name them each time they arose. Looking good, looking good. In simply seeing the constant struggle to look good, he felt more compassion and ease. As a public speaker, I have learned to pay particular attention to the times when I feel nervous. For me, that is a sure sign that I am worried about how I will look. In this state, I am not really open to others. At these moments, I directly experience how these thoughts create suffering. I hold my worry with a kind attention. Then I remember that it is my job to teach meditation, not to teach Jack Kornfield. In a moment, I relax. I become more fully present. As Pema Chodron tells us, being preoccupied with self-image is like coming upon a tree of singing birds while wearing earplugs. When we release our grasping of self-image, there is a huge relief, and the world. When we release our grasping of self-image, there is a huge relief, and the world opens itself to us again. Another way we create identity is seeing ourselves as a member of a particular ethnic group, religion, tribe, caste, and class. I can identify myself as a middle-class, university-educated American. I can identify with being a Buddhist. I can identify with my ethnic roots as a Jewish Persian person with Russian and Turkish ancestors. Each identification is a description of a particular circumstance and social structure, but on a deeper level they too are tentative, an illusion. Sometimes tribe and ethnic descriptions are used in healthy ways, to honor our culture, to awaken dignity and respect, to value our deep connection with others like ourselves. But these same distinctions can be used for racist and discriminatory purposes, creating enormous suffering. Ethnic, religious, and tribal identifications are repeatedly exploited for power and security, for separating us from them. Modern demagogues have used this identification to stir up powerful hatred for the other. Hate mongers so successfully inflamed the feelings of Bosnian Serbs and Croats that they created the recent cycle of horrendous wars and ethnic cleansings. Hindu fundamentalists fan tension between Hindus and Muslims in India, all to gain political power. Here in the United States, similar fears and identifications are exploited in the conflicts between established citizens and new immigrants. Working with gang members, I see this all the time. Young men from the same neighborhood are forced to identify as either Crips or Bloods. At times their very life depends on a secret sign or the color of a jacket. At the root, these identifications are not who we really are. In one of the most revolutionary statements of all time, the Buddha urged every one of us to see through the blindness of identification with role and caste, with race and belief. He declared, "Since you are searching for understanding of self, don't ask about caste or class, riches or birth, but instead ask about heart and conduct. Look at the flames from a fire. Where does the brightness arise? From the nature of wood. And it doesn't matter what kind of wood. In the same way, the bright heart of wisdom can shine from wood of every sort. It is through virtuous conduct, through loving kindness and compassion, and through understanding of truth that one becomes noble. As we examine our self-image, our tribe, our roles, we can acknowledge that they are tentative. We can learn to honor them without being completely identified and lost in them. When Shakespeare was writing his plays, the limitations were only his imagination and the wide range of theatrical possibilities. But sometimes he directed his own plays, and then, while he could make certain choices, he had to follow the common script used by all the actors. In this role, his freedom was curtailed. At still other times, Shakespeare himself became an actor. Then his only freedom was to vary his interpretation and recitation of his lines. But in each of these roles, Shakespeare knew who but in each of these roles, Shakespeare knew who he was. Inwardly, he was not limited to the role and the script. In each of our lives, we will have periods when it seems that we are the author, with great freedom to choose a direction. And then there will be times when more limited roles must be fulfilled. Parent, breadwinner, citizen, community member, contemplative. A mature life requires an ability to enter each of the roles given to us. Freedom arises when we hold them lightly, when we see them for what they are. Identification with self. After more than a century of looking for it, brain researchers have long since concluded that there is no conceivable place for a self to be located in the physical brain and that it simply does not exist. Time Magazine 2002. Now we have to wrestle with one of the deepest and most demanding aspects of Buddhist psychology, the experience of non-self. Ajahn Chah said, "You have to consider and contemplate this slowly. You can't just think about this or your head will explode." It turns out that it is not just our roles and self-images that are tentative without solidity. Our very sense of self is at its base untrue, only a concept. Buddhist psychology calls this selflessness or no self. Ordinarily, we identify with our habitual ways of acting, perceiving, thinking. Our body, thoughts, feelings, and personality all seem to be ours. And yet, upon examination, all these are also tentative, subject to change. We might be sick one year and healthy the next. We might be anxious and depressed at one stage of our life and confident at another. Even though we are reclusive for years, we might change to become more social, but we continue to think of ourselves as a shy person. We take each identity to be who we are, but in truth, we are not fixed in this way or that. An older man, a lifetime smoker, was hospitalized with emphysema after a series of small strokes. Sitting beside his bed, his daughter urged him, as she had often done, to give up smoking. He refused and asked her to buy him some more cigarettes. He told her, "I'm a smoker this life, and that's how it is." But several days later he had another small stroke, apparently in one of the memory areas of the brain. Then he stopped smoking for good, but not because he decided to. He simply woke up one morning and forgot that he was a smoker. We do not have to wait for a stroke to learn to let go of our identification with body and mind. We can train ourselves to release clinging to the body. Otherwise, as our body changes weight, gets sick or ages, we will suffer. We must care for our body, but if we grasp an image of it, it will be a problem for us. Joel, a 47-year-old Buddhist practitioner, developed multiple sclerosis, which progressed rapidly. In the first few years, she lost her balance, then she couldn't walk well or carry things, and finally she needed a wheelchair. As she got weaker, she felt more and more apart from the world. She felt ashamed, as if there were something intrinsically wrong with her. Then she came to a retreat with the American spiritual teacher Ram Dass, whose books, starting with Be Here Now, and lectures have inspired a generation of meditators. After more than 30 years of teaching and service to the poor, Ram Dass has had a major stroke. He too was in a wheelchair. His speech was impaired, and yet he was bright and joyful and free. He said, "If I take my body to be who I am in trouble. But I have learned this is not who I am." Joel's life was transformed by this encounter. I remember speaking with Ram Dass when he first returned to public teaching, 2 years after his stroke. At this point, his speech still came painfully slowly. His legendary wit and spiritual perspective were impeded by a struggle to find the simplest words. When I asked him how it was to start teaching again, he replied that it was hard. "Because," he went on with a smile, "they want me to be Ram Dass, and I'm not him anymore." When we inquire carefully into the question of identity, the creation of self is discovered to be a moment-to-moment process. Like the meticulous observation of lunch I described in chapter 4, we can examine our experience and see how every moment is comprised of many microscopic events of bodily sense impressions, feelings, perceptions, and thoughts. These events arise and pass quite simply. And then we can also notice how this sense of self is added to them and I is created. We identify with some part of our experience, owning the feelings, the beliefs, the inner narrative and stories as me and mine. As soon as this identification, the self-view arises, it creates the illusion of separateness of I and other. But the self and sense of other are not solid, any more than Texas and Oklahoma are different when we are standing at the state border. Without adding this identification, each moment's experience is just what it is, suchness without anyone owning it. One of Ayan Chah's favorite ways of teaching this truth was to get his students to question their social identities. Sometimes he would start by simply exaggerating our roles, introducing us like stock characters in a play. That monk is my full professor, our resident intellectual over there. He has 2 graduate degrees, thinks all the time. I don't know how it all fits in his head. And this monk we call Sleepy. He sleeps all the time, even when he sits up. And that one, he's a tough guy. He loves to fight. He's in conflict with everything. And this is our depressed monk, never smiles. The world's really heavy and he carries it about in his monk's bag. And me, I'm the teacher. That's a good one. Then Ayatcha would laugh with a great sense of freedom and say, it's simple. Be the knower, not the owner. When the thinking mind is quiet and the attention careful, all of a sudden we get it. We take a step and realize that no one took it. They are just the sensations of body movement along with sights, perceptions, impulse. Thoughts and opinions arise, but they think themselves and disappear. Like bubbles on the Ganges, says the Buddha. When we do not cling to them, they lose their hold on us. In the light of awareness, the constructed self of our identification relaxes, and what is seen is just the process of life, not self nor other, but life unfolding as part of the whole. It is critical to note here that selflessness does not deny or reject our experience in any way. We don't get rid of anything. The experiences are the same. All that's changed is that we have stopped identifying with them, stopped calling them me or mine. Some people feel as though a huge weight has lifted. They sob with compassion for themselves, realizing the illusory burden they've been carrying. More often we simply relax and discover a natural ease as we let go of the limited sense of self. As a Buddhist psychologist, I am aware that sometimes when people hear about the teaching of selflessness, they can become agitated or afraid. This is because focusing on selflessness is not always the right medicine. Speaking of selflessness, when a person feels shaky, traumatized, and fragile, can bring up feelings of disorientation and even terror. At such times, what is needed is safety and a feeling of balance. We can provide this balance through our reassuring presence, through the reminders of compassion and spacious awareness. But even those who are fragile can eventually benefit from the freedom beyond self-image, beyond the illusion of self. I think of Catherine, who had gone through several years of depression. Now feeling better, she was attending a week-long retreat. After an afternoon meditation, she came to see me, worried about selflessness, asking, who will I be if I lose myself? How will I operate in the world? From the point of view of her limited self, it seemed threatening and impossible. I told her to relax and not to struggle to understand, just to stay present with compassion. A few days later, she walked in to see me with a big grin on her face. She said, I was practicing mindfulness, and after a very quiet sitting, I was getting up to go into the garden. When the intention came to get up, the body rose, and I realized that it all happens by itself. I felt so liberated, so light, so free. I just stood there and laughed aloud. The whole idea of believing in herself was like a wonderful joke. It's obvious now. She smiled, twirled in a circle, and danced her way laughing out of the room. Like Catherine, we fear the loss of ourselves, but the reality turns out to be quite different and perfectly safe. We relax and discover we can let go of the false sense of self created by identification. Selflessness gives birth to the tender heart. We have all had the experience of being with people who belong to life in an easy and flexible way. They don't take things personally. They are gracious, receptive, present, yet not rigid. There is not a lot of clinging to their point of view, not a strong attachment to the way things should be, not a rigid grasping of me or mine. Dipama Barua of Calcutta, one of my teachers and a revered Buddhist elder, exemplified this spirit for me. She was both a meditation master at the highest level and a loving grandmother. When I visited her apartment, she would teach in a practical and modest way. Around her was a palpable sense of stillness and profound well-being. It was not the well-being of outer security. She lived in a tiny apartment in one of Calcutta's poor neighborhoods. Nor was it the well-being of rank and position. She was mostly uncelebrated and unknown. Though she was a remarkably skillful teacher, her selflessness bloomed in her smile, in her care for others, in her openness to whatever was needed. She was both empty and radiantly present. Deepama's heart seemed to pervade her whole body, the whole room, all who came into her orbit. Her presence had a big impact on others. Those who lived nearby said the whole apartment block became harmonious after she moved in. One day, a student complained that ordinarily his mind was filled with thoughts and plans, judgments and regrets. He wondered what it was like to live more selflessly. So he asked Deepama directly about the alternative. What is in your mind? She smiled and said, in my mind are only three things: loving kindness, concentration, and peace. These are the fruits of selflessness. With selflessness, there is less of us, and yet presence, connectedness, and freedom come alive. Selflessness is not a pathologically detached state, disconnected from the world, nor is it a state where we are caught in a new spiritual identity. See how selfless I am. Selflessness is always here. In any moment we can let go and experience life without calling it me or mine. As the beloved Tibetan Master Kalu Rinpoche has said, when you understand, you will see that you are nothing, and being nothing, you are everything. When identification with the small sense of self drops away, what remains is the spacious heart that is connected with all things. Practice the creation and dissolution of self. To say there is a self is not true. To say there is no self is not true. Then what is true? Ayan Shah. The creation of self is a process that can be observed moment to moment. It arises when we identify with some part of our experience and call it me or mine. My body, my personality, my views, my things. We can become mindful of the creation and dissolution of the sense of self. We can see what it's like when the identification with self is strong, when it's weak, when it is weak, when it is absent. Choose a day to study the sense of self. Every half hour check in and notice how strong the sense of self is. At which times of day is it strongest? In what roles, situations? How does it feel when self is strong? How does the body feel? How do others respond to this strong sense of self? What would happen in the same situation without a strong identification with the self? Notice when the clinging to self is mild or absent. Is it reduced when you relax or when you prepare to sleep? How is it when you take your role lightly? Let yourself experiment with caring but not taking things so personally. Can you operate well when the sense of self is not strong or even absent? Play with the sense of self. Notice what ideas, sensations, emotions you hold most strongly and identify with. Which ones do you easily release and let go? How about if you reverse it? Release the strong ones and then identify with the weak ones. Become mindful of the comparing mind. See how the sense of self arises when we compare ourselves with others. How does this form of self feel when it is grasped? How is it when it is absent? Then notice what happens when you are criticized. If someone insults or disagrees, disparages you, notice the strength of the sense of self. With strong identification, you get anxious, angry, upset. Without much identification, you can laugh. Finally, try this. Pretend there is no self. Let all experience be like a movie or a dream, without grasping or taking it seriously. See how it lightens the heart. Instead of being the star of your own movie, pretend you are in the audience. Watch how all the players act, including yourself. Relax without a sense of self and rest in awareness. See how your life plays out without grasping. Whew, a long one today. Yeah, quite long. Well, that is it for today. Good night.